The Romans had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Sultan. Their emperor was captured, setting the empire on dire straits. I have used up the monies of the Romans in the reorganization of the armies and in wars, and I have impoverished the nation. Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes would not only lose his pride, but also his throne, life, and heartland. Welcome to History's Influence. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to help us along our journey to 10,000 subscribers. I'd also like to give a big shout out to my patrons, Dark Age Sage, Sal Procopio, and Two Jacks and an Ace. Now, onto the video. The Byzantine Empire was the direct continuation of the Roman Empire of antiquity, which had reduced in size over the centuries. Most notably, the western division of the empire was lost to Germanic barbarians, and the wealthy provinces in Africa and the Levant were lost to Arab Muslims. This meant by the Dark Ages, the Eastern Roman Empire had become a predominantly Greek-speaking and Orthodox Christian society. But these earlier losses would not prove nearly as existential for survival as a third major invasion. The Seljuk Turks, who won the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 AD, would initiate the Turkish settlement of Anatolia, the heartland of medieval Byzantium. This key loss permanently weakened the Byzantines, who could never fully recover the peninsula. As a result, their position as a strong power would gradually decline and fall, despite attempts at recovery, until their capital city of Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, signalling the end of an empire. The traditional view states that the decisive defeat at Manzikert was the primary cause of Anatolia's loss. But is this really true? Was it perhaps just a small symptom as part of a downwards trajectory, which held roots decades before Emperor Romanus's humiliation? What can we learn from before, during, and after the battle, to figure out if the Battle of Manzikert broke the defences of the Byzantine Empire? Speaking of defence and safeguarding, I'm thrilled to introduce Private Internet Access, sponsor of this video and my personal VPN of choice, which acts as an impregnable fortress for my online privacy, unlike the Byzantine Empire's defences after Manzikert. A VPN hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection, keeping your activity invisible to your internet service provider, network admins, and government censors. PIA is the world's most transparent VPN, with over 30 million downloads. They never record or log user data, which has been proven in court repeatedly, and also through an independent audit by Deloitte. PIA unblocks all major streaming services, allowing you to change your device's geolocation so you can access content you can't see in your home country. You can check out Manzikert 1071, Doomsday for the Byzantines, a Turkish historical drama with English subtitles, which is usually only available for a select few countries. Just switch your location to Turkey and you're set. PIA also works on all platforms, and can protect an unlimited amount of devices simultaneously. PIA even supports peer-to-peer file sharing. You can grab private internet access right now at 83% off by clicking my link in the description or pinned comments. That's only $2.03 per month with an extra 4 months free. It's also risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. Visit piavpn.com/historiesinfluence to secure this amazing deal. The Byzantine Empire, in the decades preceding Manzikert, was the largest and most powerful it had been for centuries. So, what exactly went wrong? How did the tables turn so quickly? Medieval Byzantium reached its apogee from the 10th to 11th centuries under 3 key and consecutive emperors who were loyal to or part of the Macedonian dynasty. With Byzantium's traditional enemies at their weakest, centuries of peripheral losses and a defensive posture could finally be transitioned into a period of expansion. Basil II was the final and greatest of these 3 emperors. After spending the early decades of his life being sidelined by his court and facing 2 large-scale revolts of military officers claiming his throne, Basil was eventually able to forge a rhetoric, and to a large degree reality, of individual omnipotent control. He was an outstanding and attentive leader who would micromanage details both large and small, leaving the empire with new territories to manage and a large fiscal surplus despite continuous warfare. His leadership throughout military campaigns in Bulgaria gave rise to a new and loyal military officer class, some of whom would provide future emperors or found their own imperial dynasties. Whilst he was arguably the greatest Byzantine emperor, Basil II never married or sired an heir to succeed him. Soon before his death in 1025, he would appoint his co-emperor brother to take his position. But neither his brother nor longer-lasting female relatives, the children of his brother, were able to re-establish a stable succession, with the Macedonian dynasty eventually going extinct in 1056. Whether it be the Macedonians or appointed in-laws, appointed rulers would be too old, would die too young, would not secure a son as heir, would be deposed, and sometimes have their eyes gouged out. The usual. This instability stemmed from Macedonian weakness, highlighting the secret of empire, whether it be from the Rome of antiquity or Byzantium of the Middle Ages. No family descent, social class, degree of virtue, achievement, or religious claim could officially declare someone emperor. No succession law was established since the Roman Empire's founding. Eunuchs, empresses, regents, and old or controversial emperors began to utilize bribery to secure their rule. They provided elaborate shows and gifts to would-be rebels. This would contribute to Basil's large fiscal surplus, likely being spent in under a decade. This is despite the prior conquests made, allowing for more tax revenue, and stronger protection against raiding. These factors created economic expansion in agricultural yields and secondary production. This overspending doesn't mean that potential rebels weren't mistreated, however. They would often keep potential rebels away from the army, demote them, and sometimes use outright suppression. Numerous families targeted were those that Basil II had built up himself, weakening the effective ties of loyalty which defined his later reign. Consequences of such infighting would begin to create flaws in the Byzantine military performance. Petty officer infighting bungled an invasion of Sicily in 1038. Basil was planning to pursue such an invasion right before his death, which I believe likely would have been successful under his unified leadership, illustrating the worsening offensive capabilities of Byzantium. Byzantium had stopped expanding, except in small portions to the east. They would offer Georgian and Armenian lords estates in Anatolia in return for the more eastern lands they held. Of course, despite these issues, there were still capable and hardworking emperors which came to the throne. But the most notable emperor's reign, under Constantine IX, we'll call him by his surname Monomachus, also illustrates worrisome developments that continued to stew. Most notably, the budgetary situation continued to worsen. Bribery continued to be utilized to maintain Monomachus's power to combat weak dynastic ties. Salaries and excess titles continued to be granted to powerful families and individuals. More concessions continued to be granted to the church, including tax exemptions. And a bureaucracy that had been growing since Basil's death continued to expand, helping administer the acquisitions of the reconquests, alongside granting an administrative bloat to defend the emperor's own position. Although high spending also held less ambiguous benefits, Monomachus was also able to patronize the Macedonian Renaissance, which flourished to its greatest extent. Such spending helped lend to the idea of Monomachus as being a civilian emperor, a common trope of the emperors following Basil. This is further supported by his appointment of eunuchs as commanders, but this is reasonable given that he didn't find support in the military officer class. Why give rise to a potential usurper by appointing them to a high position? This civilian emperor assertion is also challenged by the fact that Monomachus still performed complex military maneuvers whilst leading an army himself. Additionally, as opposed to what is commonly asserted, Monomachus increased military spending due to increased warfare and costly losses, with new and challenging foes arising, who were dynamic and decentralized, and therefore hard to come to peace with. Monomachus lost much of Italy to the Normans, Viking-descended mercenaries who came to dominate southern Italy. The empire would lose its last Italian city of Bari in 1071. The nomadic Turkic Pechenegs from the northern steppe, who feigned loyalty to the Byzantines, were placated, but only after serious losses forced new armies to be raised to defeat them. The eastern frontier was challenged yet held stable. A new enemy had arrived. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't a plane. It was the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were an extended family of Uz Turkic nomads from Central Asia. They converted to Sunni Islam in 985, serving as mercenaries for Muslim powers east of the Caspian. Their armies largely comprised of light horse archers. Similar to the Normans of South Italy, the Seljuks would prey on the weaknesses of their employers to gain advantage. Successful raids attracted more followers, leading eventually to large-scale armed invasions, led by a central army under a Seljuk Sultan, They would forge a large Seljuk empire, centered in Iran. It was the leader of the Sunni Muslim world, supplanter of prior Shia Muslim dominance. Whilst the Seljuk nobility would begin to merge with the feudal aristocracy of Iran and other regions, autonomous Turkoman tribesmen were also part of the empire. A great nomadic migration was occurring, bringing Turkic families and livestock to the Middle East. The Turkoman would often serve within the Seljuk army and leadership, but they would also conduct independent raids into foreign lands, and didn't care strongly for the empire's strategic interests. They preferred raiding cities past key fortifications, more so than incrementally conquering land through acquiring key fortifications. The Seljuks, be it the Central Army or the autonomous Turkoman, led under Sultan Tugrul I, began to raid Byzantium's frontier in the 1040s, with raids, ambushes and the like. Muslim powers would often complain of Turkoman raids, and with Tugrul being the gracious leader he was, he would instead encourage the Turkoman to attack the Christian Byzantines. Emperor Monomachus refused to pay tribute to placate the Turks, although the first diplomatic contacts began. In any case, the Seljuks continued to move further west, eventually conquering the small periphery states on Byzantium's eastern frontier. Tugrul lost a proper confrontation against the Byzantines in 1055, as the Romans had better adapted to their nomadic style of warfare by this point. The locals would withdraw to strong fortified towns, such as the impregnable Manzikert, relying on larger armies than merely the local ones to deal with the invaders and raiders. Frankish and Varangian units were posted in local and nearby teams, provinces, to provide such aid, with the Varangians moving out to cut down scouts and the like. The proper Roman army mustered in Caesarea, a defense-in-depth strategy showing the seriousness of the Turkish threat. This was the same place they mustered to start reconquering land from the Arabs. The Byzantines had officially taken a step back in their eastern posture. Whilst Byzantium held an effective defence for now, the domestic situation would continue to unravel, with Basil II's pause on political machinations well and truly at an end. Numerous groups now had a say as to who would be emperor: military officers, clergymen such as the Patriarch of Constantinople, powerful eunuchs, even the populace of Constantinople. For example, a brutal civil war deposed Monomachus' successor, allowing the military officer and key figure Isaac Komnenos to seize the throne in 1057. Isaac was already 50 years old, yet he was an intimidating and fierce ruler who looked up to Basil II. He pursued a rigorous reform. He cut salary spending on aristocrats, being the first emperor to directly address the spending deficit. He also increased church taxation, cancelled tax exemptions to religious institutions, and even deposed an Orthodox patriarch. He also strengthened frontier defences, as the Turks were raiding more and more deeply, up to Melitene by this point. Byzantine guerrilla tactics were used, with direct engagements becoming more and more difficult. It wasn't that the Byzantine army or defences themselves were being downgraded, as is the traditional view by this point, but instead that the Turkish attacks were intensifying, likely in size and quantity. Turkic migratory pressure from the east likely would have contributed. Anyway, despite such wise reforms, aided by strong military officer backing, Isaac would die of an illness after spending only 2 years on the throne. His chosen successor, Constantine X Ducas, who reigned from 1059 to 1067, would reverse Isaac's major reforms, with his reign being poorly documented but marked by poor leadership and clear decline. Emperor Ducas placated the church and restored increased court salaries. But to manage the worsening budgetary crisis, he downscaled the army and defences to pay for such measures. He also likely increased taxation in return for reduced army conscription obligations in the teams of interior Anatolia. This worsened local defences when Turkish raiding was still intensifying, a double whammy which greatly weakened the integrity of the eastern frontier. Emperor Ducas died in 1067, leaving the empire in a far more endangered state, although he did finally secure dynastic rule. However, Ducas' sons were too young to rule, and so Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes was appointed, a military general who would serve as a military emperor who would deal with the existential Turkish threat. Romanus married Ducas' ex-wife to ensure dynastic continuity, also gaining her support, thanks largely to his dashing good looks apparently. However, the rest of the Ducas clan were not happy with Romanus' appointment. Furthermore, the fiscal situation was worsening, with the annual salaries being paid with silk goods rather than the usual gold. But Romanus did not reform spending, and chose to pursue expensive and rigorous campaigning against the Turks. The Turks were pushing deep into western Anatolia, although they were not settling to live within Anatolia yet. despite temporarily capturing small fortifications here and there. Romanus' military strategy revolved around plugging up the gaps of defense along the frontier, his first big move being the successful capture of the Syrian city of Manbij from Arab control in 1068. Following the capture of Manbij, Romanus tried to hunt down the chief raiding parties within Anatolia, with mixed results. By 1070, Romanus was back in Constantinople, needing to secure his domestic situation against an unhappy Ducas family. He increased his favour with the Komnenos family by appointing Emperor Isaac's nephew Manuel Komnenos to campaign on his behalf. Manuel was captured but was actually able to get a Turkoman band leader to defect to the Byzantines, who gave the emperor information on Seljuk battle tactics. Romanus began to build fortifications. Anatolia had become compromised, and to change this situation required serious action from Romanos. In the meantime, the Byzantines would soon lose key fortifications on the frontier to the Seljuk Empire, near Lake Van. Most notably would be two cities, Kalat, and the town previously considered impregnable, Manzikert. This gap in the frontier could not be allowed to stand. Emperor Romanus had signed a false truce with the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, in February 1071, who wished to stop raiding Byzantium in favour of conquering land from the Fatimids. Romanus wished to retake important towns and put an end to the endemic raiding. He believed decisively defeating the Turks on the battlefield would be the most effective strategy. Romanus raised a 40,000 strong army in Constantinople and marched it to Manzikert, hoping to catch the Sultan lacking. Such a large army had likely not been raised since the time of Basil II, and Alp Arslan was busy campaigning in Syria. When Romanus closed in on Manzikert, he realised the town was not strongly fortified, so he sent 20,000 of his troops to retake nearby Kalat, led by Joseph Tarkanietz and a Norman/Frankish mercenary unit leader named Roussel de Belial. This was an incredibly unwise decision. They were 45 kilometers in hostile mountainous terrain, and in spite of this had poorly gathered intelligence. They were not aware that Alp Arslan's scouts had informed him of the Byzantine army, which they knew the exact location of. He had lifted his siege of Fatimid Aleppo and was close by, with an army approximately 30,000 to 50,000 strong. It was too late to recall Tarkaniet's army by this point. The exact fate of the army is unknown. Anyway, when the Byzantines finally learned a Turkish force was arriving, Romanus didn't know it was Alp Arslan's army, so he sent over a small contingent, which faced heavy resistance. Further help was dispatched, but they pursued too far, and the leading general was captured by the Turks. And so by nightfall, the main Roman camp was surrounded by Turkish cavalry, with a small Byzantine contingent of 1,000 Uz Turks defecting to their Turkish brethren. This was already a clear military loss, but not a complete disaster. Yet. On the 25th of August, Turkish envoys had offered peace, with Arslan promising not to raid the Byzantines. Romanus rejected this offer. The Turkoman tribes outside of Arslan's control would have raided Anatolia regardless. Not to mention, the heavy cost of raising a 40,000 strong army, alongside the serious political ramifications of a win or loss in the battle, could have led to the Dukids overthrowing Romanus' rule. He was assigned emperor to deal with the Turkish threat after all. And so, Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes marched his army out on the 26th of August, 1071. What ensued was the Battle of Manzikert. There are two versions of the battle itself. The first interpretation starts with a false Turkish retreat, which the emperor decided to stop pursuing, but his signal to turn around was misinterpreted as a signal that the emperor had fallen and that a retreat was necessary. Panic ensued, and masses of troops fled the battle. This may have stemmed from a rumour created by the treacherous Andronicus Ducas, the general leading the rear who fled the battle. Perhaps Romanus assigned him to the rear to placate the Ducas faction, but regardless, such an appointment backfired severely. The Turks then wheeled around and attacked the confused Byzantine army and camp, killing off stragglers in mounted pursuit. The emperor was left alone with his bodyguard, and captured after a fierce fight, the first Roman emperor captured since Valerian in 260 AD. The second interpretation of the battle has the same elements, but described as a formal battle, with the right wing of the Byzantine army defeated, with Andronicus's rear force coming into clutch by treacherously fleeing, with the emperor then being surrounded and taken. Despite the battle costing the Byzantines a low amount of casualties, perhaps 2 to 8,000, the victory was celebrated across the Seljuk world. It was a humiliating disaster which caused a sea change in the Islamic perspective of Byzantium. The empire, with its Anatolian heartland, was no longer an unshakable entity, which was able to halt Arab invasions for centuries. What is most humiliating for the emperor, of course, was his own capture. It is said that the Sultan asked the emperor a question whilst he was in captivity. "What would you have done to me if our positions were reversed?" the Sultan asked. "I would have killed you cruelly," the emperor answered. This surprising honesty impressed Alp-Arslan, who instead chose to show grace. The Byzantine historian Michael Ataliates claims that these actions and more caused the emperor and others captured to agree that the Sultan was worthy of victory, although Romanus still had to kiss the Sultan's boots and receive a boot on his neck. But after such a display, Arslan was a kind man, apparently never uttering a negative word of the emperor, and they came to a fair peace agreement. Romanus promised to cede towns and regions such as Manzikert and Vaspurakan. This came alongside annual payments to the Sultan, the release of prisoners, and potentially a marriage alliance. This could have diplomatically isolated the Turkoman raiders in theory, strengthening the Byzantine position against them. The Sultan didn't want to invade Anatolia after all, but such dreams would never come to fruition. High-ranking officers, such as the treacherous Andronicus Ducas, rushed to Constantinople to play politics, ignoring the gaping hole in Anatolian defence. The young son of the deceased Emperor Ducas, Co-Emperor Michael VII, seized the throne with help from his supporters. This is no surprise. Romanus had brought the empire to financial ruin and failed as an appointed military emperor. The dethroned emperor would fight and lose a civil war against Michael, even asking for Seljuk assistance, until ultimately accepting a final offer of amnesty. However, instead of the kind treatment he was promised, he instead had his eyes gouged out. This unnecessary and brutal move helped tarnish the reputation of the Ducas dynasty. Similarly, in 1072, Alp-Arslan was killed in a domestic dispute, although him and his successor were still not interested in attacking and exposed Anatolia. But the Turkoman tribesmen, alongside numerous key Seljuk generals leading such bands, would begin to quickly settle in large numbers, finding interior Anatolia appealing for their pastoralist lifestyle. The Turkoman did not prefer conquering fortifications, as we've mentioned previously, leading to a fascinating dynamic of an inside-out conquest of Anatolia. Frontier regions which still held out lost connection to the capital. The commander-turned-duke of Antioch held out until 1084, for example. With the Turks seizing the countryside, they cut off communications between cities, causing famine and scarcity. Local Byzantines would flee to coastal towns and then to islands to escape the Turkish menace. Increasing in number, these individual Turkish tribes under nominal Seljuk control were strong enough to overcome the weak Byzantine state, who couldn't muster a large enough force in Anatolia by this point. The region eventually came to be comprised of powers such as the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, named after their conquest of the Romans, the Danishmends, and also the Armenian state of Cilicia, who received large population inflows from Armenians fleeing the Seljuks. In this decade of chaos, Emperor Michael VII had a particularly atrocious reign. He was puppeteered by family members and eunuchs, whilst overseeing an economic collapse thanks to the effective loss of Anatolia and decades of deficit spending. But despite such difficulties, the Balkan half of the empire remained safe. A Bulgarian revolt was crushed, bribery was used to ally with Norman Sicily, and a marriage and potential alliance with Hungary was secured as well. It's important to note that Michael VII did send an expedition force to Anatolia, led by Isaac Komnenos, another nephew of Emperor Isaac. It was about 4,000 men strong, 10% of what was mustered for Manzikert. However, a 400-strong cavalry-based Norman contingent, led by Roussel de Belliel, had defected before a key battle, which the Byzantines were decisively defeated at in Caesarea without cavalry support. Roussel would raid and offer protection against the Turks and himself, using protection and extortion to forge a Norman state within a chaotic Anatolia. He would install a puppet emperor and face Constantinople across the Bosphorus Strait. Byzantine forces were unable to defeat Roussel. Repeated Turkish mercenary assistance was needed to finally capture the slippery Norman, with Isaac's brother Alexios Komnenos sending out a successful warrant for his capture, finally ending the ordeal by around 1075 to 1076. It's argued that this obnoxious Norman distraction was the true death nail of Anatolia, which was preceded by Norman defections even before the Battle of Manzikert. But I'd argue that relying on a 4,000 strong army to try and retake Anatolia already shows a severe lack of money and manpower in the first place. The Byzantines couldn't even muster 4,000 men to take out Russell afterwards, requiring Turkish mercenaries to do the job. In any case, Michael VII was unpopular, and was overthrown through civil war in 1078 by Nikephoros III Botiniates. Michael of course had his eyes gouged out. Actually, he didn't. He simply retired to a monastery, a common and more preferable fate for a deposed Byzantine emperor. Nikephoros III promised the Turks Nicaea in return for support, further illustrating how compromised Anatolia had become. Nikephoros proved to be another unpopular ruler, overthrown in 1081 by the young, talented, and most important general of the time, Alexios Komnenos, a nephew of Emperor Isaac. Alexios was able to establish marriage networks with families such as the Doukas and Palaiologos. He would go on to create a strong, unified regime, with a new layer of ruling class at the top being the Komnenos family. He was finally able to destroy the Pechenegs, with help from the nomadic Cumans, and he also defeated an attempted Norman invasion. These battles were costly for the Balkan army, helping the Byzantines in their transition to using larger mercenary forces. He also reacquired the Asia Minor coast, thanks to the soldiers of the First Crusade, which his son and grandson would use as a foothold to conquer the majority of Anatolia again. That was really nice of the Crusaders. Emperor Alexios, his son John II, and his grandson Manuel I Komnenos would lead a strong revival of Byzantine fortunes. But a bloody family dispute, alongside Bulgarian independence and a renewed Turkish offensive from the interior of Anatolia, would shrink the empire afterwards. After that, true disaster struck. In 1204, the Frankish Crusaders would sack Constantinople and partition much of the empire for themselves, a tragedy we know as the Fourth Crusade. That was really not nice of the Crusaders. The Byzantine rump state in Nicaea restored the empire in 1261 under the Palaiologos dynasty, but the Turks, Bulgarians, Serbians, etc. would continue to expand into the compromised empire, which would finally be conquered in 1453 by the Ottoman Turks. So, let's finally answer the video's question. Did the Battle of Manzikert cause Anatolia to be lost, and therefore break Byzantium? For starters, Manzikert itself was a terrible loss, thanks largely to terrible intelligence gathering, meaning only 20,000 of the 40,000 army fought. Emperor Romanus' insecure political position, and the Turkoman threat ever present in Anatolia, forced his hand, so he pursued a risky direct confrontation, despite the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan's offer of a truce. Treachery had worsened the outcome of the battle further, thanks largely to Andronicus Ducas. A military officer being treacherous at such a key battle reflects the dire lack of legitimacy the emperor held by this point. Casualties were low from the battle, but Byzantium's unshakable image was forever tarnished, with a gaping hole in defense now exposed. But despite these points, the impact of Manzikert was not primarily felt as a loss in of itself, but as a key flashpoint event, a spark which allowed for numerous converging factors to provoke unmitigated disaster. Byzantium's pattern of rebuilding a resilience with long-term survival within their heartland was not to follow Manzikert, with decades-long budgetary and succession issues exploding into a full-blown fiscal crisis, not to mention the Balkans, under the threat of Bulgarian revolt, alongside Norman, Pecheneg and Hungarian invasion, didn't send back up to Anatolia. The degree of bribery from Basil II's death onwards reflects a vulnerability of the imperial succession system, which alongside the appearance of new and challenging foes, strains the treasury of the empire. Even the economic expansion of the empire, which continued occurring after Manzikert, was not enough to turn this tide. It's also possible landholder magnates withheld taxes, but evidence is too sparse for this argument, and more recent scholarship challenges the idea that the landowning dynatoi crippled the empire. Although I suppose we could simply assert that the Greeks are unlucky when it comes to fiscal crises, but I digress. Looking past the cash/cream, it's worth mentioning that the Byzantines held firm before Manzikert against numerous new enemies, be it the Normans, Pechenegs, and Seljuk army, despite some losses. I also wouldn't blame the Byzantine expansion beforehand for exposing the Byzantines to such threats. The periphery states of old did not stand the test of time, hence why they were conquered by the Byzantines to begin with, and the Armenian principalities and the like were conquered by the Seljuks anyway. Alp Arslan didn't even try conquering Anatolia after his victory at Manzikert as well. It was the Turkoman raiders, some of whose leaders were semi-independent Seljuk generals. who were penetrating deeper and deeper, and in larger numbers into Anatolia that truly cost the Byzantines the peninsula. They took great advantage of a distracted empire and the exposed defences in Anatolia to turn deep raiding into deep conquest, with the carving of new states. They began settling where the Arab raiders of the past never could, being Eurasian pastoralists as opposed to Arab nomads of the desert. So, now we know what happened and why it did, but it would be worth asking a counterfactual. What would have happened if the Byzantines instead won a decisive victory at Manzikert? It would have put a strong band-aid on internal issues, with Emperor Romanus gaining legitimacy and gold. If Romanus could work to enact effective, yet unpopular fiscal reform, and sideline the Ducades, potentially overthrowing them in a civil war, then Anatolia's now plugged up defence may be more feasible to maintain. Cooperation with the Seljuk government may help wrangle the autonomous generals and tribesmen into shape, although the Turkomen would have had to have been held off for decades, so they could start migrating elsewhere. This would have been a difficult but possible needle to thread. But could a better point of departure exist to ensure Byzantine survival? Perhaps this could start with Basil II siring and adopting an heir, or it could be a later Roman emperor such as Emperor Isaac Komnenos, living longer and cementing effective reforms, and potentially founding his own dynasty. Regardless of how it happens, if the storm of the Turkish migrations was prevented, would that secure the empire's existence for centuries longer, perhaps allowing it to survive to the modern day? What if the Byzantine Empire never fell? That's what we'll be exploring in my next video, one I'm very much looking forward to making. This has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you later.